Okay,
Sure.
thank you.
Okay. Now I got the, so that I can, let's say I can pass the message to anyone that's going to see this afterwards, hopefully. And I should emphasize, by the way, that I'm also going to give the slides to the organizers so that if you want to make them available, and I'll be glad at the end of the presentation to stay, answer some questions, or simply get in touch for future context. And so the topic for today, it's somehow try to convince you that network science is a thing, that network science is not only something that is worthwhile to be researched, but it is really an important topic at the forefront now of almost every kind of scientific field in a way. And so the main idea, so I would want to start to let you know it. So why should we do this? And why do we have this kind of terminology now? And we have some people that are related to mathematics, and so they are aware of related areas like graph theory. So why do we speak now about network science? What is different and why should we do this? And in terms of trying to give some motivation, I like to start by telling about the reality. So if you think about our planet Earth, and if you think about the entire humanity, we are a lot, right? So fortunately enough, this is not the beach in Foz in Porto. This is really a photo from China, but we are 7.8 billion humans. So if you want to study something at the scale of humanity, say for instance, like the pandemics that we have nowadays, it's not easy because this is a very complex system, and all the elements of the system, the humans, for instance, and the animals and things like that interact with each other. And we might think that this kind of complexity is just if you really go to an extreme case, but in reality, inside of each of us, if you think about the human brain, even a single human brain is at the order of 100 billion neurons. So this means that even small scale, physically speaking, systems might really have big complexity. So in order to understand these complex systems, what I would like to try to convince you is that we need to look at the complex networks that define them. This is another example, in this case, a simpler example of a flights map. So for instance, imagine that you consider all airports and the flights between the airports. And so in this case, the airports will be something like nodes and the flights will be connections. And if you want to understand what's happening with the flights map, you actually need to build in a way a complex network. And so if you think about it, networks are everywhere. Right? So I can find networks everywhere. Sometimes when I want to pitch my kind of research, I used to say that if you have a network, I'm interested, but if you don't have a network, I'll find one in your data. So complex networks are everywhere. You are part of them in many layers, in many types of things. For instance, if you think about social networks, most of us are part of some kind of social network, like for instance, Facebook, where we have users, interactions between them, but you can have other kinds of social networks like Twitter, Instagram, and many others. But as a researcher, for instance, we are also part of another kind of social network. If you think about the way you are publishing your papers, and for instance, you can think that when you publish a paper with someone, you are creating a connection with that person in particular. So you can think of things like co-authorship papers and co-authorship networks, in the sense that you can build something that represents a topology on how you are researching. But this is not something that is just social. It is something that it is present on many kinds of systems. For instance, if you think about biology and about systems biology when seen as a whole, like I was saying, the brain can be seen as a network, but you can find networks mainly everywhere in biology. So I could spend 40 slides on telling you about different kinds of biological networks. An example would be, for instance, protein interaction networks that might help to explain, among other things, for instance, chemical reactions or metabolism in the human body. Some of these networks might exist physically in the real world. So although you cannot see a friendship in Facebook, for instance, some of the networks might actually be physically present. Consider, for instance, a power network, which is something that corresponds to actual power towers, power cables. And for instance, there was a failure in power in last Sunday at TCC that's put the servers down. And so these kinds of things need to be studied. You need to understand exactly what's happening, what are the implications, for instance, if a tower falls and things like that. This is not just on power networks. You can think on something like road networks, for instance, the road network of the city of Porto. And it's really present everywhere. Even when you are coding, for instance, on software, you can think about when you are coding the dependencies between the several models that you are programming, or if you are, say, for instance, someone from an area that doesn't seem to be similar to networks, like for instance, if you are studying Portuguese, English, French, but then you can have semantic networks, you can have connections between the characters. And so the main purpose of this initial set of slides is to convince you that networks are really everywhere, okay? And the main idea is that because of the fact that many complex systems can be modeled by a network, in order to understand these systems, we need to understand the networks. So a metaphor that I can give you is something like if you are studying an animal and you first need to understand, for instance, the skeleton, the topology, the structure. And in order to understand the functionality, you need to understand this structure. So networks in a way can be seen as almost like the backbone of many complex systems. And in order to actually understand the systems, you really need to understand this backbone. Now, I told you that I was going to try to give you a little bit of explanation on why we have this terminology right now, because networks are known many years ago. And the fact is that network science per se, as a concept, as a term, as a separated field, has really been emerging on this century. So to give you two examples, so in this case, we have in here graphs of citations of classical papers on network science. One of them, for instance, the one in brown, are those random networks, was a relatively unknown paper at that point in time about networks that are almost completely random. And it passed by almost unknownly, and then it got a big increase when we reach somewhere around this century. And the same thing for Granovetter paper on sociology and the strength of weak ties. So this might pose the question, why were these papers relatively unknown? And then quickly they started gaining more traction, more attention. What happened at the end, at near 2000, that's provoked this. And my explanation for this, or my intuition, or possible explanation for why this happened, is because of two main things. And the first main contributing factor is the emergence of network maps. So the problem is that back in those days, we really didn't have any big graphs. So it was not easy to actually have the networks themselves. People would need to somehow collect things more or less manually. There was no internet and things like that. And so most of the networks that we now consider to be classical emerged at the same amount of years. So the first movie actor network, so actors participating in movies like IMDb datasite, the first World Wide Web dataset with hyperlinks between pages, the first citation networks, the first metabolic networks, they all appeared around these years. So obviously, in order to study data, we need to have data. So this is one of the big things. And this kind of network maps was really increasing in terms of scale. So the first networks that appeared were relatively small, less than 1,000 nodes. Then things started to get bigger, and now we have networks that really don't fit, for instance, on a laptop like the one I am presenting this thing. So scale does matter, and we now have networks from almost all possible sizes that you can imagine. The other main contributing factor is that while people were starting to study these separately, independently, so people from sociology would study them from a social perspective, people from biology would go to the biological perspective, they started to understand that there are a set of characteristics that are really universal. And so because of the fact that this architecture, this topology, even from different domains would exhibit similarities, it kind of pushed the sense that it would be worthwhile to see the networks as a whole, right? So it was not something that we should delve into separately, but actually there was something united all the networks of real systems. Just to give you a very simple example, if you look at the distribution of degrees in networks, you can see that there are many networks in which the degree distribution follows what we would call a power law. Okay, so they are scale-free networks in a sense. And for now, it's not important exactly, even for those of you that don't know what a power law is, it's just the fact that even networks that are fairly different in domain, like the film network, or maybe email networks, even sexual context networks, metabolic networks, they all follow a very similar kind of distribution on the degree. So it was not only important to know these stats, but also an exhibit that it would really be important to understand them as a whole, and what was really somehow dominating what's happening is not characteristic of a single field. And so network science can be seen as something that is really joining plenty of different scientific domains. Now, to give you examples of possible network science topics, like to give you a general idea of possible sub-areas or some of the main classical things that we can do with networks, and I will obviously go into some detail afterwards on some of these. And one of the things that we can do with networks is look for general patterns, like the ones that I was telling you before, right? For instance, discovering that all of these networks somehow follow the same kind of degree distribution. Another very well-known phenomenon is a small world phenomenon. So plenty of these real world networks exhibit something which would be similar to saying that two nodes really have a short distance. So all of you probably had some experience in real life in which you knew someone that you discovered afterwards that they knew a common person, like maybe a neighbor, maybe something like that. And in reality, if you look at the Facebook network, you can see that nowadays, even at a worldwide scale, you are 3.5 degrees separated from anyone in the world. So this means that you probably know someone that knows someone that knows someone that knows Donald Trump, or you know someone that knows someone that knows someone that knows a native in Brazil, for instance. Okay, and obviously this would be subject to many possible in-depth details, but I just want to make you understand that these general patterns are something that we really want to capture, to understand if they are a consequence of the way the networks are being originated, for instance. Another example of a very big area is community detection. So in many cases, we want to understand how are the nodes related to themselves. So we want to have some kind of higher level organization that it is a little bit bigger than single nodes, single characters in the system, but also a little bit smaller than the entire network. And so, for instance, imagine that you are trying to sell books and you want to understand what are the persons that like romance and other persons that like maybe crime books, or you simply want to understand how are the students being distributed on your courses, what are their likings. And so there is a need for finding what groups of nodes are related. And on a normal, I would say, let's say classical data science task, this would be seen as clusters, but from the point of view of networks, we usually talk about community detection. And although it's similar to clustering, it has some differences. Another very important subtask in network science is node classification. For instance, we might want to have a ranking on the nodes. What is the most important author in scientific research? What is the most important power tower, so that if we lose it, we don't lose everything? What is the function? What is the role of a certain node? So there are plenty of studies that can give you some possible explanations, some possible metrics to try to measure these kinds of things. And it is always an active kind of field of study. Another important aspect would be to be able to compare two networks. So we might have networks with different scales, networks with different kinds of connections, and we want to understand what is a network. So to give you a more direct example, when I entered this area, when I was a PhD student, I was I was visiting a group that was dealing with brain diseases. And so they were trying somehow to look at the topology of the brain and understand what was different when you were comparing, for instance, a healthy person with someone with a disease like schizophrenia, epilepsy, or maybe late life depression. And so they were trying to understand, even when you don't show it, so when you don't have symptoms, if it would be able to actually looking at the topology to find some differences. Perhaps, for instance, maybe you want to detect it before the person develops some symptoms. And so this is also a very important area, which is how can we compare two networks. Another very big example nowadays would be related to information propagation. So if you have the structure, for instance, if you have the friendships, if you have the way people move, can you understand how things can flow? This might be important, for instance, to understand how the epidemics is spreading, or how can we actually avoid it? Or it might be also important, for instance, because you want to detect how fake news is actually reaching everyone. So how can we stop things like that? And how can we detect if this network is robust so that, for instance, the flow does not break if there is an accident on a road in Porto and that road actually makes everything stop? And for a final example of some of the more important tasks, but again, there will be even more, is link prediction. So it can be defined as a problem per se, which would be akin to, can we detect connections that are not there? Maybe you want to detect the connections because you want to predict future connections. So will this person buy this product? Will this person see this movie? Or maybe you just want to detect errors in the graph because perhaps you don't have something exact and this connection should actually be there, but we didn't detect it. So these are examples of possible tasks, which in my way are to give you a kind of a feeling of the things that are already well established as problems. So they already have a set of possible solutions, and you can perhaps see some of these tasks as something that can be applicable on your particular domain of study. Now, what I want to do next is just to give a very brief introduction to graph theory and network terms. So the idea is, obviously, I don't have time in this particular only talk to give you an in-depth review. I just want to give some notion of terms that I can use afterwards when I try to give you a more visual example, which I think will help you get a better grasp of what we are doing in here. So as I said before, you can think on the network, mathematically speaking, the abstraction as a graph. The graph would have the entities that are being analyzed, which we would call nodes or vertices. And then you have the interactions themselves, so the connections, the links, the edges, and the entire system would be then the network. So these networks, if you think about it at the most basic level, might have different properties. For instance, they might be undirected, meaning that the connection does not have a kind of direction, right? For instance, in a co-authorship network, if I publish a paper with someone, that someone also published the paper with me. So there is no direction implied. And if an actor goes to a movie with another actor, then both have that relationship. But in some networks, this does not happen. For instance, if my page has an hyperlink to another web page, that doesn't mean that the other web page has an hyperlink back to me. If you phone someone, it doesn't mean that the other person will phone you back. And so you might have, for instance, then undirected networks and directed networks. And this is just a very, very basic separation of graph features, but then you can start complicating more and more what you are representing, or rather not complicated, but enriching a little bit what you are representing. For instance, the edges might have attributes like what is the weight. Maybe if I phone someone, it is important to understand if I phoned him for 30 seconds or for 1 minute or for half an hour, or maybe if I have a road, it's different if the road is 100 meters or 100 kilometers. Or maybe I don't want a weight, but I want a ranking. I have my best friend, my second best friend, my third best friend. Or maybe I need to distinguish between edge types. I am a friend of you, I am a co-author of you, I am a co-worker. And so we might have different attributes, not only on the edges, but also on the nodes. And these attributes will help enrich what you are representing, but at the same time, they might make it harder for you to actually analyze them. And nowadays, for instance, we even have different layers or types of connections. So to give an example, in real life, maybe if you are considering the transportation network in Porto, maybe you need to consider the roads themselves and also the trains and perhaps also the subway and maybe even the bus. So you might have different layers and you want to understand what they represent, and you might have some kind of matching between those in different layers, because perhaps you are talking about Camping A, and Camping A exists both at the road network, at the bus network, at the train network. Now, the kinds of properties that I think are more easy to grasp immediately, and most of you should be familiar with them, is, for instance, to consider the number of connections. Obviously, for the number of connections, we wouldn't even need to have a proper graph, but nevertheless, I would say that it is important to understand that concept and really embrace it. And so, for instance, when we talk about degree, we are really talking about the number of connections. And we might distinguish between out degree or in degree if you are talking about outgoing edges or ingoing edges. And even simply with something like the degree, you can start to look at, for instance, things like the degree sequence. So if I would look at these nodes in here, and I would look at the amount of connections that each node has, I could somehow uncover a distribution. For instance, if I look at the in degree sequence, then this node in here has 4 incoming edges, which would be the 4, and then we have nodes with 2 and 1 and so forth. And so with this kind of distribution, we could plot like a frequency count, and this is the kinds of things that I was telling you when I was talking about the power law. So simply looking at the degree distribution, for instance, for someone which is really used to look at networks, can already tell something about the network, because it's like a fingerprint that lets you know something about it. Obviously, it's not everything, so it's not enough to look at the degree distribution, but it's just to give you an idea that it's already different to look at the distribution as a whole, as a system, and not just looking at simple nodes. So things that I should say just to give you a better feel of what's happening in here is that, for instance, real networks are usually very sparse. And when I say sparse and I use that term, I'm just saying that the average degree is much less than the maximum possible. Okay, so for instance, if you consider the friendship network in real life, it's pretty obvious that you don't know 7.8 billion persons, right? So you know much less than that. And this is kind of one of the characteristics that almost all real networks do exhibit. So the average degree is much less than the actual maximum possible. This in a way helps us because it means that we don't have things that are too dense, but just to show you another characteristic. And again, it might be not the case for your particular field of domain, but this is something which is usual. And another thing that I should point out, for instance, if you read papers about these, if you see some kinds of findings, is that not everything is connected. So this would be a forest of networks. And usually what you are seeing is the analysis of the larger fraction of the nodes, which you usually call the giant component. We could mathematically define it as a giant component, but I just want you to understand that even if you have some isolated nodes, typically people will actually concentrate on the larger fraction of nodes that tend to get connected. And as the networks grow, you tend to get a giant component. For instance, again, considering friendship networks, if you consider the entire humanity, there are, let's say, almost everyone is connected to anyone through some connection. So there are not that many groups of isolated people that actually do not contact the outside world, because it suffices to have someone, for instance, from Europe that knows someone from America to join those two components, the entire humans in America and the entire humans in Europe. So this is what would be called the giant component. Another concept that I would like to share with you, just for you to have the real notion, is that in reality, many of the networks that you see at the very raw level, they are a bipartite graph. So consider, for instance, that, like I was saying, the actor network, in the sense that you are trying to capture when two actors actually are in the same movie. The real raw data is something like this. We're pretty much separated, meaning that in yellow you might have the actors, and in here in green you might have the movies. And so perhaps actor 1 participated in movie A, actor 2 participated also in movie A, and from this you can do what we would call a projection, meaning that actor 1 is connected to both actors 2 and 3 because they have at least a common movie. So actor 1 has this connection because they both participated in movie A. And so what you are seeing here is not a representation of the raw data, but already a projection, in this case, looking from the actor's side. But you could also use the same data to produce a different kind of projection, and you could see a projection that somehow captures how are movies related. Okay, so in this case, movie A will be related to B, perhaps with a certain weight, because they share many common actors. And so this is just to emphasize the idea that even what is the right network representation is not a given. It's not easy on all possible cases to actually understand what is the best possible network. There may be even more than one possible network representation, and never lose in sight that sometimes you need to go back to the raw data and have a look at the new angle. So the networks are only, let's say, offer you the possibility of seeing the raw data through a specific angle. So an example of a bipartite network that gave origin to one of, I would say, the crown jewels of network science at the beginning was the first disease network. And when you think about how diseases might be related, one possibility would be to look at the genome. And so if you look at all the genes, and if you know that some genes are actually, let's say, are being manifested, are being shown on specific kinds of diseases, and then you can actually project them at the genes and see what genes are connected. And you can also project it on the sides of the diseases and see that these diseases are connected because they share some expressed genes, okay? And this would give origin to the first well-known, let's say, widespread pictures of networks that were really meaningful from a social perspective, meaning that people were actually understanding what they were doing and what was their usability. There was even this joke, and there was a documentary about network science in which they would say that how Kevin Bacon cured cancer, which seems like a very strange thing because Kevin Bacon is an actor, cancer does not have anything to do with it. But then it was precisely because networks are ubiquitous, and we started to toy with actor networks and looking at a small world phenomenon, but then we are now discovering things like what are the similarities, what are the connections between, for instance, different types of cancer. Now I could go on and on and on, so I don't want to bother you too much or make you leave because you are not seeing anything, let's say, at least more fun. But just to give you just one more concept, we could consider paths as being a sequence of edges between nodes. And I'm sure that this term speaks almost by itself. But if you think of a path like a sequence of edges, then you can start deriving new metrics. And for instance, one classical way in which we can characterize a node and see how important it is looking at how important it is in terms of shortest paths. So for instance, if you have a node that is really like a hub, like for instance, Rotunda da Boa Vista in Porto, maybe it is important, not necessarily because it has many connections, but because it is part of many shortest paths. And so if you remove that node, all the shortest paths will grow in terms of distance. And then you could use these kinds of notions to actually have different views on what is important. And again, none of these metrics would be the metric. So you always need to have the intuition to understand what's happening in order to actually interpret what's happening. And so this is kind of like terms that if you are from the area, and obviously these are the most basic ones in a sense, you kind of get the hang of it, and then you can talk with other persons in these terms because they help you build a terminology that you can use to actually express some network related ideas. And so what I want to do now to give you a more feel of what we can do with these kinds of things is to give you an idea on how we can visualize and explore networks. And I would say that visualization is important in this area, not only in this area, but on all areas, but because sometimes, an image is more important than 1,000 words, right? So it is very important to communicate. And sometimes a single picture might actually force someone to notice something that we were not really expecting to see. And so in many cases, you are exploring your data, and I should emphasize that visualization alone is not enough, okay? So this is part of a larger process when you are analyzing something, but on the data processing, if you are acquiring data, you are trying to filter, you are trying to get some things and then refine things and go back and forth. And so this might be something which is really something that you want to interact. And so what I want to show you now very quickly is how you could draw a network and how drawing it differently would change your perception, humanly speaking, of what a network is, how we can interact a little bit in real time, and how we can build a visual language based on the kinds of concepts that I was showing you before. So for this, I will use something called Gephi, which is an open source network analysis platform. It's not the only one, okay? So I chose this one because I'm familiar with it, but there are others like Cytoscape, for instance, more for biological related data. And so what I want to do now is to show you, and I ask perhaps the organizers that if they are not able to see what I'm showing, to let me know, because the resolution might not be good enough. So I'll just try to make sure that you can see. So I'm opening Gephi, and as a true Linux person, I open it on the terminal. So now you see that I'm using Linux, and the network that I'm going to open in here, just to show you something which I am really familiar with, is my old Facebook network. So all of the nodes that are present in here are my friends in Facebook, and all of the edges represent that they are friends of each other. So if two nodes are connected, it means that they are friends, and my own node does not exist on this network, because if it existed, I would be a node connected to all of the nodes. So this is called the ego network of myself. And why do I want to show you this particular network? Well, I want to show you that in the beginning, this is what we, let's say, humoristically call an airball, meaning that it's like an airball. So it's not easy to extract information, because as opposed to something like, say, a sequence in which you kind of have an order, it's more or less easy to perceive what comes before the other. On the graph, there is no order, there is no perfect way of drawing it. And so essentially, when you look at the network, it's not easy to actually understand what is the network itself and what it's representing. So the first thing that we can do is, for instance, toy a little bit and try to somehow draw it on a different form. So this is what we usually call in network science doing a graph layout. There are plenty of possible layouts. I'm going to show you one based in physics for firsts. This seems almost like an organic process. When I run this kind of layouts, for instance, in this case, what it's doing is interpreting the nodes almost like particles. And if they have connections, they will attract each other. If they don't have connections, they will repel each other. And so what you can see already is that you are already seeing some groups of nodes that seem to be more connected, more dense. That would be similar, for instance, to something like communities or clusters of nodes. In this case, this is only one possible visualization. If I change to another similar visualization, which I'm not going to explain into detail, but what I want to show is that now it's the exact same network I had at the beginning, but already you can perceive just by simply looking at the visualization on a very different level, what is the organization of a network. So now you can see clearly clusters. And for instance, I can do things like, let's just prevent overlap so that they are a little bit more beautifully drawn. And you can already see different things in here, like different communities. And for instance, by using software like this, and not only like this, if I actually try to run something that computes the communities themselves, and if I say, well, let's take these nodes, let's try to color them differently according to what we were doing. And now the same network that we had at the beginning is already looking quite differently, right? So this is more similar to what you would see when you see pretty pictures of networks on papers or even on different kinds of media. Okay, so in this case, we have different colors for different communities. There might be different community detection algorithms that give you different kinds of communities. In fact, if I run again this particular algorithm, is randomized in a way. So it might even happen that if you run it again, it will not give you the exact same communities. Okay, so for instance, in here I changed, and it's easy for us to communicate these communities using colors. So again, out of curiosity, because I know this network, the network in here, so this is the university. So these are persons that actually are my professors that I studied with them. And if I show you something in here, which in this case is too many names, obviously it will not be easy to look at them, but this node in here, for instance, it's called Pedro Ribeiro, which is my brother. And my brother was a person that also studied and worked on the university. So he's a friend of many persons on this cluster in here, but he's also a friend of these clusters. And these other clusters in here, for instance, this is my family, and my family from the side of my father, and the family from the side of my mother. So you can see them differently, but they are family. And in here, out of curiosity, is my football club. So these are friends from Vitoria. And because my parents, my father is also from Guimarães and from Vitoria, they are plenty more connected in here than the persons in here, okay? And this large thing in here is essentially my programming contests community. So some of them connect to the students that are participating in programming contests, but they are clearly separated from here. And then you get further and further away as you have less connections. So to communicate, for instance, in this case, we use colors, but we could also go to nodes and say, well, let's change the size of the nodes according, for instance, to the degree. And now we can change the color, we can change the size. So we could actually start communicating, and you can see in here that my brother, Hugo, is like the most connected node, and you could go and easily see things like, well, let me just compute in here the degree so that you can see that column, and I will show you here the degree. And so if I order by degree, and I can see that Pedro Ribeiro is the most highest degree. Now I have a problem in here. So I used to give this example, is that my wife is not very connected in terms of degree. So how can I show my wife that she's important to me, right? But while she doesn't have an Arabic degree. Well, like I told you, there are other kinds of centralities. And if I look at something called the betweenness centrality, so the importance on shortest paths, well, now my wife, which doesn't have an high degree, actually appears very high in here. Okay, so this shows you that the power of these metrics is really large, right? It's really important, and they measure something different than, for instance, purely the degree. And so if I look at something like, let's now change the size according to this, now we will see different things, and I can also see my wife as a hub between, it knows persons from my family, it doesn't know many persons from the university, but it knows in here, and it is important because it is a bridge between family from one side and family from one side. Now, I will not show you too many details because this is being recorded, and so you could see things like what are the actual connections. So I don't want to go into the privacy. I'm just going to show you one last thing out of curiosity, which is how easily you can communicate other things. For instance, if I change the color based on what is the sex, so male or female, you can actually see, for instance, it would be easy to put blue in here, for instance, and pink in here. And you might be questioning yourself, why do I have null sex? Well, in some cases, like in this case, this is simply an association, a group of fans from my club. So naturally, it doesn't have any kind of sex, okay? So the basic information in here, and I could go on and on, is that its graphs are a good way of manipulating a system. And if you understand what's happening, you can interact with them. Obviously, this one is small enough to be drawn, but I could now go here and start computing other statistics, start using filters, for instance, remove all males, remove all females, and things like that. So I would be happy to give you, for instance, this particular link and to help you study these things. And the perfect layout, again, depends on what you are drawing. So I will give you one last example of a layout. So I'm going to import all the airports in the world. And if I would ask you, well, what's the best way of drawing a network which is really geographical in nature? I mean, obviously in that case, because they actually have a position in the world, you can draw it using latitude and longitude. And now the nodes themselves will actually show you the world. Okay, so I'm not putting in here the flights, I could import them, but the purpose in here is just to show you that different layouts will communicate different things. And so you should choose the one that's actually the best one for what you want to express. So I'm not going to go in here. So this is where we were before. So this is just a small demo to make you at least see some more pretty things, I will be happy to show more things, but given the time constraints, I will now try to give you what I promised on the abstract, which is to give you an idea of what I'm doing on this topic, right? So until now, I'm just showing you things about network science, but I didn't talk too much in depth about what I actually have done in this area, what I'm doing right now. And so, like it was said in the introduction, and part of my PhD was dedicated to this, I have a background which is pretty much related to algorithms and data structures. And so I entered this area because we wanted to, like I was saying, separate different kinds of networks. And at that point in time, they were trying to look at subgraph patterns. So they were looking at things like, for each of these small patterns, what is their frequency? How many times do these patterns appear? What is the census of the subgraphs in order to discover what patterns are more characteristic, for instance, of a certain disease. To give you a real life example of a pattern, epilepsy, for instance, is something which relates to having more connections than what is usual. So it tends to have, for instance, more dense patterns. And so I entered this area by actually developing novel algorithms and data structure. And so it was, let's say, an easy target for me in the sense that I knew that I wanted to be faster than the existing state of the art. So it was a more, let's say, objective way of entering the field because I had very well-defined opponents, which would be the other algorithms. So this is how I entered the field. I have now too many papers to show you here about this particular kind of thing. I will put some example publications on the PDF in case you want to have a look at them, but this is something which I am still doing. So trying to find ways of efficiently counting subgraph occurrences and trying to actually infer significance from them. And because of the fact that this is a very difficult problem, so for those of you that have a computer science background, just simply knowing if a subgraph appears at all on another graph, it's already an NP-complete problem. So we are doomed to actually being exponential in terms of running time, but in any case, we still need to do it as efficiently as possible. And one of the oldest tricks that we have as an algorithmist would be to trade accuracy for time. So for instance, I have some approaches that try to leverage sampling in order to actually have an estimation of the frequency instead of the exact counting. So I have work on these kinds of things. And I also have work on using parallelism. So how can we leverage things like very large clusters with distributed memory, or simply using all of the cores that you have in our computer, or maybe using parallel paradigms like MapReduce, and the fact that we can easily use it on clusters, like for instance, when you are renting computing power and other things. So I have work on this kind of areas. Another example, let's say less fundamental in terms of methodology, but also important in terms of application, is on characterizing and comparing networks. So given the initial motivation I gave you, it's only natural that I also have work on subgraph fingerprints. So using the subgraphs to actually characterize and distinguish networks like motifs and graphlets. In here, for instance, it's just some figures that are from a paper in which we were distinguishing precisely cancer types based on the co-expression network and showing that the patterns that are characteristic of each of these diseases are different. And so it is, for instance, we could somehow relate things like different types of lung cancers and distinguish them from breast cancer. So this is one of the things that I am interested on characterizing and comparing networks. Another applicational scenario that we are very keen on actually exploring is temporal evolution. So although I didn't say it before, these networks are not static in nature many times, meaning that they evolve over time. So if you think about your co-authorship network, it's quite different certainly from what it was many years ago. So you need to understand not only what is the, let's say, the photo of your network that you have now, but how it evolved until here, how it will evolve afterwards. And so we have worked, for instance, on comparing temporal networks, in which the difference might not be where they are right now, but on how they got there, for instance. So we need to understand how the patterns are changing. If you are, for instance, keeping to publish with the same persons, or if you are changing, although it seems to be the same kind of network, you are also changing the nodes themselves. Another example is network alignment. For instance, if you have two networks and you want to understand what is the equivalent of another work. If I would look at, say, Instituto Superior Técnico, another university in Portugal, and say, who is the Pedro Ribeiro of Instituto Superior Técnico? Or if I look at a different football team, what is the equivalent player? So sometimes we have different networks, we want to align them. And this is another specific problem, and this is another subject that we are tackling. Another example is node ranking. For instance, we have some work on actually trying in our beliefs, improving the outer ranking, okay? Or maybe on a more, let's say, fun way, actually using these kinds of rankings to compare tennis players. So I love tennis, and I wanted to prove everyone that Federer and not Nadal was the best player at that point in time. So I challenged one of my students, and we use these kinds of subgraph-based metrics to actually rank nodes. Other things that I do that are not related directly to subgraphs will be something like, for instance, the link prediction problem. So we have some work on this, and in particular, I would probably highlight TensorCast, which was an award-winning. So it won the best paper at ICDM, which is an A-star data mining conference that the computer scientists might be well aware of. And so this is, again, one of the areas in which we are very keen on exploring. Another example is on discovering communities. For instance, we tried to discover communities that were quite different in terms of their nature to the normal community discovery algorithms. So we wanted to discover communities that also follow internally a power law. We also have work, for instance, on role mining. So discovering what is the role, what is the structural position of a node in the network, and try to understand what you are actually doing on that position. And to give you just some very small examples of ongoing work in terms of actual publications. So because of the fact I'm going to give you the slides, I opted to put some example publications on each of the subtopics I'm showing you, but some subject areas which are not published yet, but should be soon, is, for instance, Vanessa's, my PhD student, and Maria Eduarda's also work on using complex networks analysis or network science to actually study time series analysis, or to actually study time series. So in a way, I would, let's say, on a very high level way, say that we can transform time series on a network that somehow encapsulates or captures some of the aspects of the original time series. And then because of the fact that we now have a network, we can actually use our bag of tools to actually explore that connection and try to discover something that perhaps was not seeable from a very raw time series perspective. And now from a network science perspective, we can actually try to analyze. So this is also to emphasize that in many cases, you might have a bridge between your area and network science if you can go from your data to a network, or if you can go from the network back to your data. Another example, which is more, let's say, fun in a way, for those of you that like sports, is football passing networks. And so, for instance, I have a paper submitted that tries to analyze, in this case, these are the most common networks of all Premier League English football teams. And so in here, we can try to analyze how the teams are playing. And because all of us wants to be, let's say, a coach. So in here, we can actually complain to our own actual coach that they are not doing what they should be doing. And we can actually show it. Another final example of ongoing or almost published work is doing this for, let's say, more complex scenarios, like I was saying at the beginning. For instance, we now have software to also compute and count subgraphs on multi-layer networks, which are substantially more complex than simple networks. So all of these things are available at my personal webpage. So I will leave the link so that you can check them. I always have the PDFs for the papers. In each of the papers, I have detail which would also point you to the software, if we have software for doing that particular thing. So I would be happy to give you not only my own software points, but also give you anything that you would also like to know from that part. And speaking about my personal webpage, maybe I should also just show you something, which is, if some of you are students at the master's level, so there is also a network science course that is given at TCC, and this is a master levels course. So like the first year of the master's, or fourth year if you have an integrated master's. And so this is a course that for the moment is the only dedicated undergrad level course or master's course in this topic. So it would be interesting if you want to learn more about this, it could be an option, or just let me know. And we have very, in my view, obviously, interesting projects that originated in here. For instance, in this year, we have persons that created a network to describe the Harry Potter books, or maybe a network that somehow describes all of the members of the parliament vote. And for instance, this work is of very good quality, and the student is even thinking, and I'm encouraging him to do so, to actually publish a paper based on what he did for this course. And again, the key thing in here was that networks allowed us to actually see the phenomenon, in this case, voting from the parliament, in a different perspective that could somehow enrich our understanding. Now to finalize, because I am running out of time in the sense that I promised Maria Eduarda that I would take 1 hour at most. And so this is what I would call our network science group. So we don't have actually a formal group that works on network science, but besides myself, there is another senior researcher involved in this, Fernando Silva, which is now a vice rector, so it has less time for doing this, but it has been on the origin of this and was my main supervisor during my PhD. At the moment, I have 5 PhD students working on this on different areas. I will leave this here because you might be interested in some of these particular topics. I would need an entire hour to talk about all of them, but I will make sure that when I do a workshop with them, I will eventually send you a link for you attending if you are interested in that. I already have 3 students that completed their PhDs on this kind of topics, and I already have aligned some master students that are working now on things related to this. And maybe just a side note saying that this is also interesting, obviously, for companies. And for instance, Ahmad working on fraud detection and Ricardo working on money laundering, for instance, are collaborations with FeedSci. And obviously networks might be a very nice way of trying to study, in this case, trying to detect fraud. And so that's it for me. So I hope that I didn't annoy you too much. And I really sincerely hope that you have been at least interested on this kind of topic. So I would be happy to answer any questions you have now or simply respond to your emails afterwards.